Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, a local peace group. The name Aware is made up of the initials of our full name, Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. We're recording this at noon on Tuesday, December 26th, Boxing Day, in the studios of Urbana Public Television, Urbana, Illinois. Our subject is the wars the U.S. government is waging around the world, and the racism against people in foreign countries encouraged sotto voce by our government. At this moment, the U.S. is making war in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, Yemen, and the Philippines. Thousands of U.S. troops are killing people in these countries, although most Americans are barely aware of it. In addition, the 70,000 members of the U.S. Special Operations Command are active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. As the rest of the world recognizes, but Americans don't, they're nothing less than American death squads. Why is our government terrorizing the world? To the point that international polls show the U.S. is by far the most feared country in the world. Not Russia, China, North Korea, or Iran. The answer is simple and horrible. The U.S. is killing people to protect the accelerating profits of the 1%, the American economic elite. Since at least the end of the 19th century, the U.S. government has been determined to prevent the economic integration of Eurasia under any power, Eastern or Western, for fear that it would hinder the economic exploitation of the world by that American 1%. That's what the unpleasantness with the Japanese in the 1940s was about, the Second World War, conquering their Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. That's why the U.S. left Russia to defeat Hitler alone in 1941, so the U.S. could concentrate on Japan. In World War II as a whole, the U.S. had 500,000 casualties, but Russia lost perhaps 27 million people in defeating Nazi Germany. The bedrock of U.S. foreign policy today remains the containment of Eurasia, Russia and China, and retarding its economic development. The American task is more difficult today at any time since World War II, owing to the effective alliance between Russia and China, and their alliance with other states, notably Iran and Syria. That's why the U.S. has 1,000, yes, 1,000, military bases around Russia and China, while Russia has 15 bases outside its territory, and China has 1. When World War II ended in 1945, the U.S. was the only undamaged major country on either side. After the war, the U.S. State Department noted that we had 50% of the world's wealth, but about 6% of the world's population. They wrote, "This disparity is particularly great as between ourselves, that is, the United States, and the peoples of Asia. In this situation, we cannot fail to be the object of envy and resentment. Our real task in the coming period," turns to the last 50 years, "is to devise a pattern of relationships which will permit us to maintain this position of disparity. To do so, we will have to dispense with all sentimentality and daydreaming, and our attention will have to be concentrated everywhere on our immediate national objectives. We need not deceive ourselves that we can afford today the luxury of altruism and world benefaction." That's what the U.S. State Department said in a secret memorandum of State Department planners in the years right after the Second World War. Our immediate national objectives since World War II have been economic control of the world. For most of my life, that was represented as a struggle with Russian communism. But we weren't told that the communist bloc never controlled an economy more than half the size that of the U.S. From World War II up to today, U.S. presidents have killed more than 20 million people to maintain economic control of the world. President Obama was the first U.S. president in history to be at war throughout 2 presidential terms. And the campaign, President Trump criticized the 8 wars Obama was conducting. Obama's war provocations against Russia and China, and Obama's drone assassinations, accurately called the greatest terrorist program in modern times. But once in office, Trump has adopted Obama's war policies, which are the policies of the earlier administrations. Our anti-war group, AWARE, was formed 16 years ago after the attacks on New York and Washington of 9/11-2001, and before the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, which began America's longest war. The founders of AWARE saw that the U.S. government would use the crimes of 9/11 as an excuse to carry on its wars in the Mideast. The U.S. government says it's fighting terrorism, but is in fact killing people in order to control Mideast oil, what the U.S. State Department called in 1945 the world's greatest material prize. The U.S. doesn't need Mideast oil. What we use here at home comes principally from the U.S., Canada, Venezuela, and Nigeria. But control of oil from Southwest Asia and North Africa gives the U.S. a chokehold over Eurasian economic rivals from Germany to China. The U.S. has been at war almost continuously since World War II, putting down challenges to its economic control of the world in East Asia, Southeast Asia, Latin America, and elsewhere. Ordinary Americans have paid for these vicious wars, but they haven't profited from them. Most Americans are not aware of how much of the world is appalled at what the U.S. government has done in our lifetimes. It's a triumph of the American system of propaganda and intellectual control, the most effective in history, that Americans are able to ignore it. Those of us in AWARE, like other anti-war groups in the United States and around the world, today call upon President Trump to, 1, establish a foreign policy based on diplomacy, international law, human rights, and respect for the sovereignty of other nations, notably Russia, China, Iran, and Syria. 2, end the wars in the Mideast and elsewhere, stop the drone attacks, the most extreme terrorist campaign of modern times, and end the war provocations against Russia and China. 3, cut military spending by at least 50% and close the U.S. military bases ringing Russia and China. Bring all U.S. troops and weapons home, and withdraw U.S. special forces who've been sent into 3/4 of the world's countries. 4, stop the U.S. support of human rights abusers, notably Israel and Saudi Arabia. And 5, lead on global nuclear disarmament. Revoke the Obama administration's trillion-dollar plan to update U.S. nuclear weapons. There's a lot of news about U.S. government war-making this week, but you don't get a very clear account of it in the American media, which of course represents the views of the American political establishment and are in the business of manufacturing consent to those views from you. We try to give a better account, and we'll start that account tonight with an announcement made by the Trump administration just before the holiday, a new 55-page national security strategy, which supposedly has been in the works since the beginning of the Trump administration, and in fact extends work being done in the Obama administration. It was announced by the Trump administration coming into office and prepared throughout this calendar year, they say. This national security strategy, what the U.S. intends to do in regard to war-making around the world, defines Russia and China as revisionist powers. Revisionist in this sense means revising the setup that exists right now, the setup of American world domination. They are described as rivals and, for all practical purposes, strategic competitors of the United States. The National Security Strategy document, referred to by the shorthand NSS, the NSS stopped short of defining Russia and China as enemies, allowing for a, quote, attempt to build a great partnership with those in other countries. You've heard that in the president's rhetoric. Still, Beijing, that is China, the Chinese government, qualified the document, as reckless and irrational. The Kremlin noted its imperialist character and disregard for a multipolar world. Iran, predictably described by the NSS as the world's most significant state sponsor of terrorism. Obvious nonsense to the rest of the world, but that's the position of the U.S. government. Russia, China, and Iran happen to be the three key movers and shakers in the ongoing geopolitical and geoeconomic process of Eurasian integration. And that's what the U.S. NSS, the the National Security Strategy, is directed against. The NSS can certainly be regarded as a response to what happened at the BRICS summit in Xiamen in southern China last September. BRICS is the acronym for an association of 5 major emerging national economies: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Then, Russian President Vladimir Putin insisted on the BRICS countries' concern over the unfairness of the global financial and economic architecture, which does not give due regard to the growing weight of the emerging economies. President Putin also stressed the need to overcome the excessive domination of a limited number of reserve currencies. That was a clear reference to the U.S. dollar, which accounts for nearly 2/3 of total reserve currency around the world and remains the benchmark determining the price of energy and strategic raw materials. Trades in these matters throughout the world is conducted in dollars, and the control of the dollar is what gives the U.S. an unparalleled advantage in the worldwide economy, which has immediate bearings on the strategic, that is, the war-making capacities of the various countries. That brings us to the unnamed secret at the heart of the NSS, this new document from the Trump administration. And that secret is the Russian-Chinese threat to the U.S. dollar, or to the dominance of the U.S. dollar in world commerce. The website of the China Foreign Exchange Trade System, the arrangement by which China carries on its trade with the rest of the world, recently announced the establishment of a yuan ruble payment system, yuan being the basic Chinese currency, ruble being the basic Russian currency. What the Chinese government was announcing was a world economy conducted not in dollars, but in the Chinese and Russian currencies. They hinted at similar systems regarding other currencies participating in what's been called the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI. That's the Chinese attempt to link Eurasian commerce by a system of land and sea routes in a large new international exchange arrangement. After all, Russia and China have increasingly traded bilaterally in their own currencies since the 2014 U.S. imposed sanctions on Russia. The Obama administration imposed sanctions on Russia after the coup that the U.S. engineered in Ukraine resulted in Russia asserting its control over Crimea. This is about the implementation of a huge new alternative reserve currency zone bypassing the U.S. dollar. So in this matter, strategy, that is war-making, and economy, that is world economy, are bound up together, and both sides, the U.S. on one side and China and Russia on the other side, understand what the terms are. The decision by the U.S. to issue this new national strategy document follows the establishment by Beijing in October of 2015 of the China International Payments System, CIPS, China International Payment System. CIPS has a cooperation agreement with a private Belgium-based SWIFT international bank clearing system through which virtually every global transaction must transit. Now, what's happening here, the SWIFT system, another acronym, is a method for countries to settle their debts in different currencies. That is, if Russia owes China $100 million, it can settle that debt in its own currency or in some other currency by working through what is basically a large exchange bank, the SWIFT system. That system has been controlled but not has been dominated but not controlled by the United States. What China is doing is setting up a system that will bypass the SWIFT system for settling debts between countries. What matters in this case is that Beijing, as well as Moscow, clearly read the writing on the wall. Clearly read the writing on the wall when, in 2012, Washington applied pressure on SWIFT. It blocked international clearing for every Iranian bank. The U.S. actually used its muscle to keep this international system from settling accounts with Iranian banks as part of the sanctions the U.S. was putting on Iran. Washington applied pressure on SWIFT, blocked international clearing for every Iranian bank, and froze $100 billion in Iranian assets overseas, as well as Iran's potential to export oil. This was part of what was at stake in the so-called Iran nuclear deal, an arrangement to combat this American attempt to strangle the economy of Iran. In the event Washington might decide to slap sanctions on China, bank clearing in the event that Washington might decide to extend its sanctions to China, bank clearing through CIPS, this parallel system that China has set up, works as a de facto sanctions evading mechanism. Last March, Russia's central bank opened its first office in Beijing. Moscow is launching its first $1 billion yuan-dominated, Chinese currency-dominated, government bond sale. Moscow has made it very clear it's committed to a long-term strategy to stop using the U.S. dollar as their primary currency in global trade, moving alongside Beijing towards what could be dubbed a post-Bretton Woods exchange system. Bretton Woods, the name of a small town in New Hampshire where the meeting was held, was an arrangement that came out of the Second World War. It was actually arranged before the end of the Second World War, whereby the U.S. would dominate the world economy. That Bretton Woods system has existed with important changes since 1944. What Russia and China are doing here is moving out of that system. The U.S. understands the threat and considers it very dangerous indeed and is willing to go to war to present it. Gold is essential in this strategy. Russia, China, India, Brazil, and South Africa are all either large producers or consumers of gold, or both. Following what has been extensively discussed in their summits since the 2010s, the BRICS, the independent countries, are bound to focus on trading physical gold. Now, remember, in the 1970s, the Nixon administration took the U.S. off the gold standard for the dollar. You couldn't take your dollar into an American bank and say, I would like the right amount of gold for this dollar. But you can do that with other currencies around the world. Markets such as COMEX, the commercial exchange in New York, actually trade derivatives on gold and are backed by an insignificant amount of physical gold. You can't get gold for your dollar. Major BRICS gold producers, especially the Russia-China partnership, plan to be able to exercise extra influence in setting up global gold prices. The world currencies would go back on a gold standard, which the U.S. abandoned in the 70s. Intractable questions referring to the U.S. dollar as top reserve currency have been discussed at the highest levels of J.P. Morgan, international bank, for at least 5 years now. There cannot be a more politically charged dossier, set of problems. The NSS, the new strategic standards of the U.S., duly sidestepped it. But that was what was at stake in the strategic arrangement. The current state of play is still all about the petrodollar system. A petrodollar is the money that oil producers receive for their oil. They sell oil for dollars. And in order to buy oil from, say, Saudi Arabia, you need dollars to do it. They are called petrodollars, and the dollars that go to Saudi Arabia are then deposited in New York banks. This arrangement between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia has existed since 1974, and it formalizes the oil for dollars arrangement that is one of the major reasons for the U.S. Desire to control the flow of oil from the Middle East. Since last year, what used to be a key secret informal deal between the U.S. and the House of Saud, the government of Saudi Arabia, is firmly in the public domain. In other words, it was never quite admitted that the U.S. insisted that oil from the Mideast be sold in dollars, but it was, and those petrodollars came back to the New York banks. Even warriors in the Hindu Kush, that is in Pakistan and India, may now be aware of how oil and virtually all commodities must be traded in U.S. dollars, and how these petrodollars are then recycled into U.S. treasuries. Throughout this mechanism, Washington has accumulated an astonishing $20 trillion in debt. That is, $20 trillion that is owed to the U.S. Vast populations all across MENA is the Middle East and North Africa, also learned what happened when Iraq's Saddam Hussein decided to sell oil in euros. Just before the U.S. invaded Iraq, the Iraqi government, which a major oil producer, said no, it'll accept euros now rather than dollars for its oil, and indeed would prefer euros. Some think this was the major cause for the U.S. assault on Iraq, and it was certainly involved. Muammar Gaddafi, the murdered leader of Libya, Hillary Clinton's minions killed him by sodomizing him with a bayonet in the revolution, if that's what you can call it, that Secretary of State Clinton supported and produced in Libya. Muammar Gaddafi, before the American attack on him, planned to issue a Pan-African gold dinar, a gold-backed currency that would once again bypass the American dollar. But now it's China who's entering the fray, following on plans set up way back in 2012. And the name of the game is oil futures trading priced in yuan, with the yuan fully convertible into gold on the Shanghai and Hong Kong foreign exchange markets. You can see why the U.S. is upset. The Shanghai Futures Exchange and its subsidiary, the Shanghai International Energy Exchange, have already run 4 production environment tests for crude oil futures. Operations were supposed to start at the end of 2017. But even if they start sometime in early 2018, the fundamentals are clear. The triple win, oil, yuan, gold, completely bypasses the U.S. dollar. The era of the petro-yuan is at hand. Of course, there are questions on how Beijing will technically manage to set up a rival mark to Brent and WTI, or whether China's capital controls will influence it. Beijing has been quite discreet on the triple win. The petro-yuan was not even mentioned in National Development and Reform Commission documents following the 19th Chinese Party Congress last October. What's certain is that the BRICS supported the petro-yuan move at their summit in Xiamen in China, as diplomats confirmed to international reporters. Venezuela is also on board. It's crucial to remember that Russia is number 2 and Venezuela is number 7 among the world's top 10 oil producers. That's why the U.S. has been so busy trying to produce a revolution in Venezuela. Considering the pull of China's economy, they soon may be joined by other producers. Yao Wei, chief China economist at Société Générale in Paris, goes straight to the point, remarking how this contract has the potential to greatly help China's push for yuan internationalization. An extensive report by DBS, a bank in Singapore, hits most of the right notes linking the internationalization of the yuan with the expansion of BRI. In 2018, 6 major BRI projects will be on overdrive: the Jakarta-Bandung High-Speed Railway, the China-Laos Railway, the Addis Ababa-Djibouti Railway, the Hungary-Serbia Railway, the Malacca Gateway Project in Malaysia, and the upgrading of the Gwadar Port in Pakistan. Major banks estimate that BRI as a whole, the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, will generate no less than an additional game-changing $2.5 trillion worth of trade in the new year, per year. It's important to keep in mind that the belt in BRI should be seen as a series of corridors connecting eastern China with oil gas-rich regions in Central Asia and the Middle East, while the roads seem to be soon to be plied by high-speed rail traverse regions filled with, what else, unmined gold. A key determinant of the future of the petro-yuan is what the House of Saud will do about it, what Saudi Arabia will do about it. Should Crown Prince and inevitably future King MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, opt to follow Russia's lead, to dub it as a paradigm shift would be the understatement of the century. Yuan-dominated gold contracts will be traded not only in Shanghai and Hong Kong, but also in Dubai. Saudi Arabia is also considering to issue so-called panda bonds after the Emirate of Sharjah is set to take the lead in the Middle East for Chinese interbank bonds. Of course, the prelude to D-Day, when the House of Saud officially announces it accepts yuan for at least part of its exports in China. Revisionist Russia and China may have committed an unpardonable sin. They have concluded that pumping the U.S. military budget by buying U.S. bonds that allow the U.S. Treasury to finance a multi-trillion-dollar deficit without raising interest rates is an unsustainable proposition for the Global South. Their threat, under the framework of the BRICS as well as the SCO, that is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which includes prospective members Iran and Turkey, is to increasingly settle bilateral and multilateral trade bypassing the U.S. dollar. When the beginning of the end of the petrodollar system, established by Kissinger in tandem with the House of Saud way back in 1974, becomes a fact on the ground, all eyes will be focused on the NSS counterpunch, war and economy bound up together here in American policy. You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the last week of 2017. Another week in which the world can see that the most extensive global terrorism is not made up of just the attacks by ISIS and its sympathizers around the world, but by U.S. worldwide war-making. We'll conclude tonight with an interview this week with the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov. Given the malign nonsense the U.S. political establishment is putting about concerning the supposed Russian meddling in the U.S. election, it's good to hear some sense from another nuclear-armed power. My thanks tonight to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, for research. See No's notes on the blog News from Neptune. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Ethan Young. Thanks to also this program and others like it will be available on YouTube. And see the Facebook page for Aware for articles referred to tonight, and a link to Aware's anti-war teach-in on YouTube. and to Nicholson Baker's important article, Why I Am a Pacifist, The Myth of the Good War. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about but Americans don't, Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others, who truth-tellers persecuted by the U.S. government. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Karen Aram, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, David Green, Ed Mandel, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night, good luck, and Happy New Year.
I would like to ask you about something very specific. One of the greatest challenges this year, specifically North Korea. This issue has been widely discussed. How real would you say is a nuclear conflict on the Korean Peninsula? What the United States is after with its saber-rattling? Many specialists say that its goal is to raise the stake to such an extent that North Korea is forced to capitulate on American terms. Do you agree with this analysis?
I don't think that any sane person would like to have a war on the Korean Peninsula. You would have huge losses of life. These assessments have been voiced by us, by the Americans, by American officials. I don't think that any sane person would like to have such intentions. Well, at least I hope so. But, you know, we've heard different voices and indirect voices. But even if you don't want a war, when you have so many weapons, high-tech weapons, destructive weapons on both sides, you always have a risk of a human error. It might be equipment failure. But I hope that those who deploy those weapons and who hold those provocative drills, I hope that they are aware of those potential errors. I hope that the U.S. does not harbor any plans of a military intervention. But, you know, over the past months, there's a trend and I would like to disclose some of the details of this trend. I don't want to disclose too much information, but in September we received a signal from the US that they want to start dialogue with North Korea, that there would be no new military exercises until next spring, and we could use this natural pause for building some kind of dialogue. We have transmitted that signal. That signal was not rejected. But while we were doing those preparations, the US said that they would hold extraordinary military exercises that they would have in October. So in September we received one signal, and in October all of a sudden you have major exercises. To our surprise, North Korea did not respond. And it seemed to us that they wanted to squeeze that kind of response out of them. So they have these unprecedented in-scale exercises. And, you know, they've announced another round of drills, and North Korea responded to that, and they launched a new missile, which to us seems to be an intercontinental ballistic missile. So China and Russia proposed to have a double freeze. North Korea would not launch anything, would not test anything. But the US, and again, the US should not have any exercises, but the US responded that it's all legitimate, it's legitimate to have exercises. And the US says that, again, all nuclear tests and missile tests are banned by the UN, and this is indeed so. But I believe it's a too formal an approach. When you have such culmination of tension, I think the first step forward should be done by the party which is mightier and which is smarter. And we hope that there are people in the US who believe that this situation should be resolved through diplomatic means. So, together with China, we believe that all these mutually provocative actions need to be frozen. Dialogue needs to be started without any precondition. So it's either face-to-face talks or with participation of other countries. So they just need to exchange their assessments and their proposals on how to de-escalate this crisis. We know that there are six-party talks. Definitely, we are open to this, and at the third stage we would move to this multilateral process where we would agree on the parameters of peace and security on the Korean Peninsula in general. But at the same time, we cannot forget about those signals that the US has sent to North Korea regarding the Iranian nuclear deal. You know, if you challenge that nuclear deal, it means that we had this nuclear pact, and Iran shut down its nuclear program entirely. And if it's challenged, well, there's been a lot of fuss around it, and the US has made it, and the US has not withdrawn from this deal. But everyone fears that, including US allies. So the signal to North Korea is, you should refuse from the military nuclear program. We would lift sanctions, but once we have a new administration in place in Washington, we might change our mind. So I feel this is a very important aspect, and you cannot strangulate the economy of North Korea. You cannot impose a total blockade. They need to be aware of this. We just passed a new UN Security Council resolution. We've managed to get rid of, extreme things. We've managed to keep some of the projects that would would be of benefit to Russia. But we've got calls of new possible meetings that would initiate further crackdown on North Korea. Well, Mr. McMaster once said that US diplomacy would only rely on force and prowess on the strongest military in the world. Well, if it's still the case, that's really bad. We are in store, and it means that we are facing turbulent times and tests and tribulations. President Putin favors a unifying approach, not trying to isolate anyone, but trying to build an inclusive dialogue.
Going away from Russia-US relations, I would like to ask you about Syria. Recently, at the 8th round of talks in Astana, an announcement was made that the Pan-Syrian Congress will take place in Sochi on January 29th, 30th. Do you think we're getting closer to a solution for the Syrian conflict? You talk to world leaders, to international players. Would you say the international community is ready to put an end to this war?
Now, here's the most important point. we see that the vast majority of those who are fighting on the ground, who used to fight and are still fighting on the ground, they are ready for talks. We now have 4 de-escalation zones. It means that opposition groups are ready to de-escalate, are ready to build dialogue with the government, stop bloodshed and move on to peaceful life. Things are getting back to normal. You already have institutions back in place, the institutions that used to exist, institutions that people used to trust and still trust. So those opposition groups have been invited to hold local dialogue meetings, like providing humanitarian aid to the local population. They will have checkpoints manned by countries that are guarantors of peace in Syria. And if we talk about the southern de-escalation zone, you have Russia and the US. You still have Jabhat al-Nusra, you still have ISIS that have not been defeated. Jabhat al-Nusra is part on the terrorist list of the UN Security Council, but despite our reminders, the US-led coalition does not want to crack down on it, to dismantle it. It means that they still harbor some plans to preserve it for the future. And perhaps some still wanted to go back to the initial plan to initiate regime change. Just recently, the UN Security Council considered a resolution on mercenaries in Syria and how to fight them and other aspects of the anti-terrorist agenda, and the resolutions were approved. We would like those proposals to be more determined and resolved, but still, they've been quite effective. And we saw that sort of dual attitude to Jabhat al-Nusra. They didn't want to mention it. We told them, why don't you want to mention it? Because it's on the terrorist list of the UN. And, you know, there's a principle, try or extradite. They say that this principle should not be used necessarily. And they also said that if a jihadi person has not committed any crime, or maybe he harbored some terrorist plans but has not put them into practice, he should not be considered as a terrorist. There have been other voices too at the expert level. You know, we've been promoting attempts to counter extremist violence. You know, they say that there are dictatorships who crack down on human rights, and it means that the US insists that the international community should explain to the local population how to build democracy, and in this case you wouldn't have reasons for extremist sentiment. Well, I hope that everyone understands what's behind it. So that's what the concept that the US has been promoting, and they've been trying to speculate on our shared cause. Well, actually, we shouldn't use those goals to promote their own agenda, which means a regime change. Now, going back to Syria specifically, on the readiness of those who are fighting on the ground, and again, those people are moving back to a peaceful life. So they are ready to move back to peaceful life. But how ready are external players? I can only speak for Iran and Turkey, those who I've been working with. Iran and Turkey definitely have their own concerns. It does not necessarily coincide with our concerns. For Iran, that's protecting the rights of Shiite groups, and for Turkey, that's the Kurds. But definitely we need to promote reconciliation between Shia and Sunni. We need to hold a new Amman conference that would ensure that Shia and Sunni declare solidarity, and it's high time to start dialogue on this. They need to stop accusing each other of evil intentions. These are two major regional countries. They definitely have interests in adjacent territories. They need to shape their own rules. We are ready to facilitate this process. We're also pushed a new concept for security in the Persian Gulf region. As for our Western counterparts, and Syria, I have mixed feelings. We have some, dialogue with the US on the military situation and de-escalation. This dialogue is not always public, and based on our dialogue, we can see that the US acts in a pragmatic way. They say that Syria should be maintained as a country of many religion groups, many ethnic groups. Rex Tillerson used to tell me that the main goal of the US in Syria is dismantling, defeating ISIS. But right now it's getting vaguer and vaguer. They say that they will stay in Syria until an inevitable political process would start in Syria, and some even add that a process when Assad should go. Well, it's just like the same as when they promised us that NATO would not expand in the 1990s. The manner is almost the same. I'm not sure that other Western countries are interested in having this crisis resolved through any means. Some Western countries, European countries, seek to impose their leadership. They want to demonstrate to the entire world that without them you would not be able to resolve it. We don't have that egotistic approach. We put forward the Astana initiative, and it was one of the tools to help pacify the situation on the ground. We were able to distinguish sane opposition groups from terrorist groups. ISIS terrorists are now fleeing those territories into other countries, but that's a separate topic. Now we put forward an initiative convening the Syria National Dialogue Congress. The Astana process, the Astana talks were convened after 10 months of delays in the Geneva process. And once we launched the Astana process, those who organized the Geneva talks, they said, okay, we also have a new session. Now, this year, the Geneva platform also had delays. Saudi Arabia facilitated solidarity among opposition groups. We helped it too. But the Geneva talks again experienced some delays. Now we have the Moscow, Riyadh and Cairo opposition groups that came together. Saudi Arabia helped in that. But the leaders, who were elected as part of this united delegation, started to issue ultimatums which were absolutely unacceptable. Then they tried to discredit our Saudi counterparts who have told us, and Mr. de Mistura, the UN Special Envoy in Syria, told us that this delegation would come to Geneva without any preconditions for direct contacts with the Syrian government. So they've cheated on our Saudi counterparts and on Staffan de Mistura. Well, Staffan de Mistura paid a visit to us, together with our defense minister, Minister Shoigu. We explained that the Syrian groups have behaved in an unacceptable way, and at the same time we've been also working with the government so that it pursues a constructive policy, but it cannot accuse the government of refusing to talk to those who've issued an ultimatum that Assad should go. Some of the extremists were taken out of those opposition groups before the talks, but obviously there are still some people with extremist views who might be influencing others. But at the same time, as I said, we are pushing for the Syrian National Dialogue Congress. And again, this is in line with UN Security Council Resolution 2254, and it says that we need to have direct talks between delegations of the government and the full spectrum of the opposition. And as we understand, the Riyadh, the Cairo and Moscow groups don't represent the full spectrum of the opposition. Most of those who come to Geneva are emigres. They live in European capitals. They don't live in Syria. But in order to comply with the UN Security Council Resolution 2254, we called on everyone. We used our military at the Hmeimim air base. They've established some contacts. Apart from establishing de-escalation zones, apart from bringing life to normal in Aleppo and other cities, we've engaged about 1,700 people in the efforts to promote the political process. We have sheikhs, we have tribal leaders. Some of the tribes did not take part in the war, but they live on those territories and they have a say in the future constitution. But they are not represented by the opposition groups that come to Geneva. So we have a long list. We are now finalizing this list with our partners who are guarantors of the Astana process, Turkey and Iran. We had a trilateral summit in Sochi where this initiative was supported, and we explained it to Mr. de Mistura. It doesn't mean that we try to hijack an initiative from the Geneva process. It is an attempt to help launch this constitutional process, not in this narrow format, narrow platform where emigres would be represented. No, this would be a platform which would be most representative. Once this Committee on the Constitutional Reform would be formed, the Geneva talks would be resumed, and definitely we would support this process led by Mr. de Mistura in the UN.
Mr. Lavrov, I just want to clarify something. The United States has about 10 bases in northern Syria. Does this help with the consensus or not?
Well, I don't think that it has a lot of impact. We know that the Congress has been supported by most of the Syrians on the ground. The US does have some air bases, but we got information that they train some of the military groups there, including from those who used to be part of terrorist groups. You know, the Syrian government has been really pragmatic in cooperating with our aircraft mission, who were legitimately invited to help fight terrorists, and with the US-led coalition. And again, this helped to destroy ISIS. We needed to shake up the US-led coalition. It used to be pretty passive at the very beginning, and we knew that with our help, we would destroy ISIS together. But before we came there, the US-led coalition has been very lenient and condescending on Jabhat al-Nusra and also on ISIS. But that's a separate topic. We've been very pragmatic. We've been cooperating with the US and Jordan and the southern de-escalation zone. Amman has a trilateral monitoring center. And we have the Holland Heights close by, and we need to accommodate the concerns of Israel. So it's a very complex issue. So many factors are in play. And there are many external players there. Some promote their own agendas. Some try to help their tribal groups or people of the same faith. Others don't want to see some groups strengthening in Syria, but we definitely need inclusive Syrian dialogue that we want to launch. We need a dialogue where every group would be represented and where every group's interest would be upheld in the future architecture of power in Syria. Without that, the Geneva process would not be successful. So at the end of January, we would have this Congress, and this would help to make a new practical step towards this constitution process. It definitely requires far more groups than those represented in Geneva.